From the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security, this is NATO 2020, a new podcast series pitching fresh ideas for the world's oldest military alliance. I'm your host, Terry Schultz. I'm a freelance journalist, and I've been covering NATO for a long time. So I know a lot about how it's been doing things, but this podcast is going to be about how it could be doing things differently. The Atlantic Council commissioned a series of 20 recommendations as to how the 70-year-old alliance could freshen up a bit for the coming decade. Some of these are ideas we've heard before and talked about a lot, and some are brand new. All of them are aimed at making NATO more responsive and resilient to the threats that certainly get more creative all the time. I'm going to be digging into those ideas with their authors. This episode, the recommendation, Game Out Decision-Making. The author, Sir Christopher Harper, who served as the UK military representative to NATO and the EU from 2011 to 2013, and as the Director General of the NATO International Military Staff from 2013 to 2016. So he spent a lot of time in Brussels as well. Thank you so much for joining me, Chris.
It's really great to be with you, Terry.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest. A lot of the recommendations that we've been talking about in these series come very naturally to me, talking about, the 2% spending guidelines, or talking about Russia policy, how NATO can really ramp up against Russia, as Sandy Vershbow has written. Then I got to yours, and I have to say, I have a lot of questions. But
well, that's good. Let's go for it.
Some of them are simply vocabulary. But first of all, I'm going to have you sum up the essence of your recommendation.
Well, thanks, Terry. So the essence of the recommendation really isn't so complex, albeit it's all about dealing with complexity in a better way, in a more confident way. There is technology which is available to us now that will help us to harness complexity. What do I mean by that? Well, the world that we inhabit today is simply drowning in data. There is just so much of it that we cannot hope to make sense of it. And yet as we do all of this, there is a way that we can harness that data and we can use it to our advantage. One of the things it seems to me that NATO has lost in recent years is agility and speed. That is because it tends to be a rather old-fashioned organization when it comes to its decision-making process. It has to achieve consensus for every single thing that it does. And that is right, absolutely right. And it has to continue to do that. The legal and the moral authority that is gained by having that consensus arguably has never been more important than it is today. But somehow we've got to do it quicker than we do it today. Now, all that data, models that exist, artificial intelligence that is growing and being exploited all around the world, one thing that can help us to tackle that complexity. But one of the other things that's out there is the phenomenon of distributed computation, the ability to use thousands and thousands of computers all running together in the cloud to model the world as we see it, to create a virtual world. It's something actually that young people today use more and more for their leisure time in computer games. But use these virtual worlds to create a parallel model of the world that we inhabit, and then we can use that to look at some of the complexities that exist and perhaps start to understand the consequences, both intended and unintended, of our actions, of our thoughts. Take those in a virtual world before we do them for real. Not human out of the loop, not humans absolving themselves of their responsibilities for decision making, but finding tools to help them understand the complexity of the situation that currently exists.
Okay, I'm going to stop you there because that's a good summary and you made it sound very unintimidating to understand. And I hope people are reading along with us on your recommendation, people are going to go, click. We get to SSE. What is NSSE. I mean, this is something we need to understand this, because you've just explained it without using your fancy terminology. So go ahead and tell us what this alternate reality that you're talking about.
The alternate reality, a single synthetic environment.
Yeah.
How should I describe this to you? Imagine, as I said, distributed computation, bringing together multiple models of the world in which we are at the moment. So all those layers, from space down through the air above us, the weather, each one of these is a layer. And then the fixed communications network, the mobile communications network, the sewage system, the power grid, the telecoms network, the road system, what's going on the sea, what's going on under the sea, what's going on in the information network. Every single one of those a model, making a layer in our parallel universe, if you want to call it that. That is a single synthetic environment. So that can be a country, it could be smaller than a country, it could be a city, it could go down to a street level, or it can be series of countries, groups, a region, or indeed one day, when we get to that level of computational power, the world. Well, let's start small. Country size model with all of those layers. So then geographically, we can pinpoint a particular area in our model. Each one of those layers is like a big music synthesizer deck where you can slide rheostats up and down. You could adjust one layer a little bit and see what the consequences were of that action in another layer, or indeed in all of the layers. So now you start to see consequences intended, the adjustment of your layer, and what they are unintended in the other layers.
And how many of those would you bring into NATO's, NATO's sphere of control? I mean, we're talking about the 30 allies, but you'd also be talking about Afghanistan, Kosovo, Iraq. I mean, are you talking about bringing in any environment in which NATO operates right now so that you can test out your ideas? And are these people sitting in like this huge, room full of, with their virtual reality goggles on? I mean, how does this work in, practically?
Well, different people have got different ways of wanting to interface with this sort of technology. Some people, like you say, will want to use virtual reality goggles and play a game down at street level. And that is entirely possible in a synthetic environment. But the strategists are going to be able to want to take probably a more spreadsheet, graphical view of our world so that they can see, for example, the impact of changing something in a power network on that nation's economy, or indeed on the neighbours' economies. So really, it's whatever really meets your requirement best is the answer. The classic military sandbox is possibly one of the display formats that can be used, but buyer's choice. And the other part to your question was, where should it be? It can be anywhere, Terry. We could model the Baltic states. We could model France or Germany, friendly states. We could model the areas of the world where we feel there is likely to be conflict or crisis in the future. Just imagine if you'd had this technology as COVID started to hit, and you were able to model the spread of that pandemic and understand just a little better what the consequences intended and unintended were of doing some of these lockdown measures that some countries have been involved with.
Okay, so we're talking about the tools to do this, but that is only the beginning of my questions, because now that was just to get to sort of an understanding of how this could work if we were there yet. But of course, my specialty is dealing in the politics of NATO. And I hear all this and think, yeah, that sounds really fun for the gamers, but politically, you mentioned that consensus slows NATO down as much as it also gives it power. Are you really talking about removing the need for consensus from decision-making in NATO? Because I don't see how that could happen. It comes up, but I've never heard it discussed seriously. You would know more, you've been inside.
The last thing I would ever want to suggest is that NATO moved away from consensus-based decision making. It is the bedrock of the alliance. It is where NATO draws its political, moral, and legal authority. But let's make that consensus building process considerably easier than it currently is. So just imagine, again, that we have an unfolding crisis, but we're able to visualize that crisis considerably better. We're able to understand how what we call the PMECE process, political, military, economic, the societal impacts are all having their effects in this crisis. And we're able to show members of the North Atlantic Council and the Military Committee the consequences of actions that they might take either to mitigate that crisis or to deal with it using either traditional or non-traditional methods. And by the way, the important thing is here, I talked earlier on in this interview about complexity. A lot of the complexity that NATO faces is in this sub-threshold hybrid level of conflict and crisis, where it really is very difficult to understand whether somebody is being an adversary or if this just is force of nature. This sort of technology helps us penetrate that gloom.
Okay, I'm sold. I'm sold on the technology. I don't understand it, but I like it. I see its usefulness. I definitely know that the simulations that NATO does all the time on cyber attacks really provide a lot of, practically real world experience before you have a crisis like that. I still don't see how you're going to get NATO politicians, because that's who make the decisions, the ambassadors, the people who have different constituencies than the ones who would be gaming this out and coming up with these different potential, pathways. How do you get them to pay attention to that? So many decisions at NATO are derailed. I won't say so many, but enough decisions are derailed by bilateral disputes on on other issues. Turkey and Greece, is one example. You can come up with, perfect data, and military planners do. And still then here come the foreign ministers or here come the defense ministers and don't pay attention to it. They make different decisions. So they won't be reading these long, detailed reports, will they?
Well, long and detailed reports. What I really want to try and encourage is a different approach to visualizing crises and conflicts, both below and above the classic threshold as they're occurring. And for all members of the North Atlantic Council and the Military Committee to be able to have that capability. And that new wonderful NATO headquarters building in Brussels, I absolutely know there are the spaces where this technology could be applied. Now, is it ever going to get rid of the political issues that you've just described, the bilateral issues between two nations who
that have
want
nothing to do with NATO? Yeah.
Well, they might have nothing to do with NATO, or indeed they might be a little bit of quid pro quo, a little bit of bargaining on other issues unrelated to a crisis. No, of course not. But the really important thing is that the potential to speed up the decision making on the crisis or the conflict or the emerging issue itself is made considerably easier, because every single person is able to see the same information. Everybody can test it to their own assumptions and see what the consequences of that test is. So, because though, now you could, if you imagine a hub and a spoke system, and the spokes are out to each of the capitals of the NATO allies, all of the allied capitals can see this situation the same way into the synthetic environment that I've been describing. Then, of course, the bilateral issue can be dealt with probably far quicker as well. So I actually see this as a win-win for the alliance.
That sounds very optimistic from someone who's been in those rooms when you fight over a word for days on end.
Oh, you're right. But and the amount of shoe leather that I used and the odd drinks I had to have at very strange times of day trying to broker agreement between two nations over something that was completely unrelated to the issue at hand will never go away. But I do think this would help us in the future.
So what about hacking? It's something that we worry about every day in every system, and NATO is attacked, thousands of times a day or some crazy high number like that, and fends off all of them that I know about. I'm sure they're not all of them, but we don't hear about it. So how that seems like there would just be so much more opportunity in that case for the ever more skilled hackers to get in and see exactly what you're doing, exactly what you're looking at, and what options you're considering.
I think it's a good point, Terry, but I must say that I think that is pertinent to any sort of advance in technology that we have. I think, though, that when you look at access to hyperscale cloud, which is going to be absolutely essential if we're going to be able to harness all of the data that is so important to decision making in the future, that big banks, the financial institutions, the big pharma companies are all managing to find ways of protecting the data rather than the data transmitting or transmit network. So that is the future in this particular area as well. And I don't think we should allow that particular element to be overly concerning.
So another practical question, where would you sit this? I mean, would this require a lot of space or just a few computers like, the early hackers or the white hats, or, would this take a lot of space? I know that it doesn't. I mean, I know that you're not building models, but to have that many analysts looking at that many different levels of data and thus decision making and feeding into the decision making, wouldn't you have to set up a completely new staff that NATO doesn't possess at the moment? Or would the IT guys just sort of, and girls, just sort of take this on as another, another thing that they can do?
We talked earlier on about how you would see this, how you'd use it. It could be the big screen in the North Atlantic Council's conference room. It could be your laptop or your iPad, depending on what part of this synthetic environment you want to access and why you want to access it.
So you just go, Helmand Province. President Trump says he's pulling out more Afghan troops. This is how this will affect NATO. I mean,
pretty much.
Really? Okay, so the UK is already testing models like this. I read in your recommendation. So how far is your country along, and what have you learned so far?
Well, it's not just the UK. The organization I do a little bit of work for, called Improbable, which absolutely has its original roots in gaming, but very quickly understood how this technology could be used in the defense and security space, has contracts in the United States as well as in the UK, and has explained the tech on a number of occasions now to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In the UK, there is a technical demonstrator now in its second year. It's modeled a big chunk of the NATO area of responsibility. It's looking very closely at how that can be used in practice. And it is showing considerable worth, both in terms of how you do a bit of campaign planning, how you do training, all the way from strategic level down to tactical level, both for our nation and indeed for our allies who reinforce certain parts of the alliance at the moment.
And how's the uptake been? Everybody gets it well and trusts it. And I mean, how has that been going in terms of the people who need to use this data and implement it in their decision making?
Well, it is a technology demonstrator, but my own perspective on that is that it's going extremely well and very much showing that it's a technology worth investing in for the future. To go back to my opening comment, this is such a complex space these days that if we don't find a way of penetrating this gloom, I think we'll get left behind. Our adversaries don't have this problem of trying to achieve consensus. They essentially can work without consensus and sometimes without bothering too much about the rule of law either. And so there has to be a way that we catch up and get ahead of that loop and regain our competitive edge.
So that reminds me of another question, and that is that, as you point out, they can move very quickly without having to consult 30 governments who have to consult their parliaments, who have to take everybody into consideration. So tell me now, under your model, could this have predicted any of the sort of big watershed moments for NATO? I mean, some for the world. You mentioned that you think it could have helped with COVID. I mean, that's mapping healthcare systems. Those are some knowns. But for example, would it have predicted the annexation of Crimea? Would it have predicted Moscow poisoning Alexei Navalny or the Skripals? I mean, some of the things that really caused NATO, some disruption, are not predictable, because you're dealing with unpredictable actors on the other side, and you can't map out what they're going to do. You have no idea, and if they thought you could, they would change.
Terry, you're absolutely right, and I have
That's
to say
nice
that if I've painted a picture for you of some amazing technological crystal ball that predicts the future, then I've failed in my description of what a synthetic environment is and what it can do, because it is not a predictive tool at all. What it can be used for, though, is to analyze the best course of action to take when faced with a burgeoning crisis. So as you see things starting to move on the ground, you see public perception starting to shift, it might show you why that perception is shifting and help you understand the best course of action you could take to change that perception back. But in terms of predicting the future, absolutely not what it's there for. It's there to speed up the decision-making process when dealing with contemporary crisis or conflict.
So reducing the number of the unknowns. I mean, there will still be unknowns, but you would know more, so that there would be fewer moving parts when something unpredictable happens. That's what you're saying.
You would know more, and I've used the term a lot, so I want to be careful about using it again. But so often when we consider what to do in an emerging crisis, we are not taking enough account of unintended consequences. And it is those which quite often slow down that consensus building process, the analysis of those. And so some nations will say, you haven't considered this. But if all of that can be better depicted up front for everybody to see, then it is likely, it seems to me, that consensus building can be faster.
So you would just say, yes, I have F11, right? And your screen would change and you could show that people had thought about it. So I have to say, I mean, this has definitely been one of the most imaginative with all of the technology in it. And it expanded my brain just thinking about it. I really enjoyed it because NATO does have a huge array of now, I mean, outside of territory, not conflicts necessarily, all of them, but situations that they have to deal with. And people can't always be even maybe well versed in the situation they're going to hit on the ground when they're deployed at a moment's notice. I think the pre-deployment training could be much easier if you sit them in a room and you've got something like this to just sort of shift through. I like it to think of it in for those people.
Well, absolutely right. We've concentrated a lot on the strategic decision makers and how synthetic environments could be extremely useful, it seems to me, in assisting, not replacing, but assisting that decision making. So the human absolutely stays the most preeminent and important part of the loop. But let's also shift it down a layer or two. What about the operational planners? How would they use a tool of this nature? And I have seen actually synthetic environments played down at street level. So a company of soldiers doing a hostage rescue situation with a riot going on, in the building that they're trying to get somebody out of, and all of that sort of thing. Absolutely incredible, so that they can practice that in advance of going into that particular situation and know what it is they're likely to face.
Well, I love the imagery, and I think it's a great plan. I just think NATO sometimes seems so slow to get on board with new ideas. I mean,
I was really heartened. I was really heartened by that new science and technology strategy, which was released by NATO earlier this year, March, I think it was. The NATO Science and Technology Organization seemed to me to do a great job. But the thing that's most encouraging about that is that they're talking about knocking over some of these bureaucratic stovepipes that slows the adoption of technology of this nature. If they really are considering how to tackle that, that will be extremely helpful in being able to adopt novel technology such as this, such as AI, such as machine learning, all of which will have really, really important parts to play in the future of the alliance.
Not to mention increased attention toward bringing young people into NATO. I mean, as staffers, as advisors. There was just a youth summit, where youngsters, to me and you, brought up just ideas that our brains can't even get around. Speaking for myself,
there's a wonderful cartoon which you may have seen, which talks about the cyber warrior garden of the future, and it's this picture of a classic GI, armed to the teeth, huge sort of ray gun strapped to his chest, all sorts of antenna bristling from every part of his uniform, his headgear, and everything like that. And in the background, there's a young man in a t-shirt, ball cap on backwards, tapping away at a laptop, and he says, "No, dude, that's me, I'm over here." And I have to say, I think there has to be a new balance. We're never going to get rid of the traditional military capabilities that the alliance has needed and still requires. We are going to need the ability for kinetic action for as long as I can foresee into the future. But there is a new dimension of warfare out there, and we've got to be very aware of that as well.
That's true. And that's a good place to end it. I would just have to inject one still tiny bit of pessimism. I just can't see the consensus speeding up that much, even with all the data, because sometimes it seems like coming to that decision at NATO isn't based on needing more data. But I'd like to think you're right. And I think increasingly you will be right.
Terry, thank you. If we don't speed up that consensus process, then arguably we're going to lose the competitive edge that NATO has enjoyed, because it would just wrest it out of our hands. And we must not allow that to happen. If this technology can help, then it's technology that should be adopted.
A good warning note to the alliance from someone who's been inside. Thank you so much, Sir Chris Harper, for your recommendation, Gaming Out. Now, to our audience, you can find all 20 ideas, including this one, at atlanticcouncil.org. Tell us what you think on Twitter at #StrongerWithAllies. Thanks, Chris Harper. If you're interested in learning more about single synthetic environments, check out this video from Improbable.
From whole of government crisis response to the grey zone of hybrid warfare, every action and reaction can have consequences that ripple across the whole of society, and even across the threshold of conflict itself. In overcoming the challenges we face, the central question is one of confidence. How can we be confident that we understand our environment in all its endless complexity? How can we be confident that we understand our options and the cascading consequences of each one? Models and simulations can help, turning data into information, information into insight, and insight into action. But although they can represent just about anything, only a synthetic environment can represent everything. It's where data, models, and simulations converge. A shared, scalable, ever-evolving simulation of the world around us that not only helps us understand the world as it is, but shows us the world as it could be. Synthetic environments, like those being developed by Improbable, can be as large as they need to be. They can integrate every domain, blend physical landscapes with abstract systems, and help us understand whole systems of interconnected systems. They can be extended, enhanced, and augmented as necessary, quickly and economically, from an entire ecosystem of relevant content and applications. We can pool our models and data and agree our assumptions. We can analyze the challenges we face and coordinate our response. These synthetic environments let us design, test, and refine new plans and policies, discover unseen opportunities, and identify overlooked vulnerabilities. Because each one is built on Improbable's open, distributed platform, you can access your synthetic environment from anywhere, on anything. How you choose to use it depends on what you want to get from it. You may need to see this virtual world in a way that promotes digitally enabled decision support and data-driven policymaking. You can view this virtual world in 2 dimensions or in 3, walk around it, sail through it, drive, fly, and fight in it. Because thousands of people can share these environments, users at every level, across organizations and alliances, can experiment, plan, train, and rehearse collectively, frequently, effectively, and cost-efficiently. Synthetic environments like those under development for the UK and US governments are engineered to help organizations transform how they function and interoperate, to help them integrate vertically and horizontally across domains and departments. They allow us to apply our imaginations, intuition, and experience to the task at hand, promoting our prosperity, enhancing our security, and ensuring our resilience in the face of future challenges.